بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. This session I wanted to discuss something that I said earlier in one of the earlier sessions. I believe it was the first session, and that was that we didn't want to call these sessions tafseer. The reason for that is I don't want to discuss a discipline that has formed in the hawzat in our seminaries, which I don't know how to describe this, but this discipline of tafsir, I feel, has moved away from the objective that I think everyone assumes tafsir has. Everyone assumes that tafsir is interpreting the Quran, or in other words, understanding, and a person presenting their understanding of the Quran. Unfortunately, the discipline has restricted that. The discipline of tafsir now has certain boundaries around it. And I'll just use one as an example, one of the limitations of the discipline of tafsir. And this can be found, you can go and refer to tafsir books and see for yourself. When it comes to the practical teachings of Islam that the Quran mentions, obviously, if we are to interpret it, if a person is to present their understanding of it, they should give a clear-cut understanding of exactly what the verse is saying regarding that particular ruling that it addresses, regardless of anything else. If there's any hadith about it, if there's any opinion of a scholar about it, whatever it might be, what does this mean? The verse that talks about hijab, what exactly does it mean in a practical sense? It's giving us practical advice, and we need to very completely and comprehensively understand that from the Quran itself. But when it comes to topics like that in the Quran, I can't fully say this regarding Sunni tafsir books, as I have not spent as much time studying them and referring to them. But I'm relatively sure that this is the case in those books as well, in that discipline, or the discipline of tafsir in the Sunni denomination of Islam or Muslims. But clearly for the Shia, I can say this with full certainty, as I have checked plenty of times on plenty of topics. The scholar who's discussing the Quran, when they get to those verses, they say the discussion of the practical aspect is left for the discipline of fiqh. We're not going to discuss it. Why? What is the reason for that? I think there are multiple reasons, and I don't want to get into that, as that's not what this session is about. What we want to do is understand Quran the way the Quran speaks, fully and 100%. Nothing more and nothing less. We don't want to discuss all the other things in Islam that are based on hadith, for example. If a verse refers us to hadith, we might mention a few of the hadith, meaning the verse refers us to the Prophet, and the Prophet continues his mission through his Ahlul Bayt, as he has said and as the Quran mentions, and inshallah when we get to those verses we'll discuss them. So the Prophet and his household, when we are referred by the Quran to them to get what they received, what the Prophet received, and they received as part of the household of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt of the Prophet, taking the mission of and the Risala of the Prophet after him. If we are referred to that by the Quran on a specific topic, we might mention some narrations that can be, perhaps, we're not going to draw conclusions, but we'll just give some references so that people understand what that might be referring to. And we leave those discussions that are not mentioned by the Quran outside of our discussions, as we are not discussing what is found outside of Quran. We are discussing what is found in the Quran. Some may say, then, are we suggesting that Hasbuna Kitab Allah or Kitabullah, that the book of God is sufficient, we don't need anything else for Islam? That's not what we're saying. When the Quran refers us to the Prophet, when he says this topic, one way or another, the Quran makes a reference for us to go to the Prophet, and whoever has the knowledge of the Prophet, which are his Ahlul Bayt, that know it precisely and without any alterations, then we need to go there. If we don't, then we're going against the Quran itself. Hasbuna Kitabullah goes against the Quran itself. You cannot say Hasbuna Kitabullah if you want to implement the Quran in its entirety, because the parts that the Quran refers us to the Prophet, and there are many, when we get to examples we'll talk about them. Right now, just for those who haven't seen it, hypothetically at least for you, there's plenty of examples we'll see. The Quran says refer to him. Then when you say Hasbuna Kitabullah, you're saying I don't want to implement that teaching of the Quran. I want to skip on that teaching of the Quran. What we are saying is, we in these sessions only discuss the Quran and fully discuss the Quran. We're not going to skip on the understanding of a verse of the Quran because it's part of a different discipline. We're not going to categorize Islam into these different disciplines and then part of Islam gets left out because it's not part of any discipline. That's not how this works. I disagree with that. I don't think that's the right approach. I don't think that's the correct thing to do. I think that we are given the book of God. He has spoken to us. Every bit of it is guidance. Every bit of it is clear in and of itself. What it's saying is not a riddle that cannot be understood if attention is given to the meanings of the words in the sentence, and if the Arabic language is a language that a person has access to. The Quran says itself that it's Arabiyyun Mubin, bilisanin Arabiyyun Mubin. It's clear Arabic. It's not riddled. It's not been twisted. It's not a foreign type of Arabic. No, it's clear Arabic. So if somebody knows Arabic, and we've said because language changes over time, modern Arabic has got a lot of similarities and it hasn't drastically changed, but we have to be careful that we use classical Arabic because we want to get rid of any changes that have occurred over the course of time. And change does occur in language, but Arabic, I think, is a language that the classical form has been preserved even in the modern form in a very in a way that I don't know other languages that are such. Doesn't mean that in colloquial Arabic and street language there aren't drastic differences. It means that formal Arabic preserves much of the classical Arabic that was spoken at the time, but still there are some differences. And so we need to make sure we understand classical Arabic. So this was one example, and there are other examples as well, that parts of the Quran have been left. They have not been discussed in the discipline of tafsir. So we're not interested in a discipline that has boundaries set on what it can discuss, what it should discuss of the Quran. We are simply going to discuss what the Quran says and nothing outside of it. We're not going to add anything to the Quran to understand it. And we're not going to skip on any understanding of the Quran. That's going to be important. Now, this means that whatever the Quran says is complete. This is an important topic that we will find. I will say this in the get-go for those who are interested in these discussions. There are many views out there that I think, I should say, are baseless and unjustified. For example, the idea that verses of the Quran can be abrogated based on some narration that the Prophet said this, or someone heard the Prophet said, yeah, that verse was revealed, but it was changed. Absolutely not, based on the discussions we mentioned in the previous session. Everything in the Quran is from God, and everything of the Quran is in the current copy that we have, the current book that we have. None of it has been omitted, and everything there is from God. If God said something and we're sure of it, and somebody says, I heard the Prophet say that this thing is there, but God removed it. No, the Quran says, La ya'tihi al-batil. There's no batil. None of it is going to be made batil. If there is abrogation of a ruling that's mentioned in the Quran, that abrogation, or naskh as it's called in Arabic, must happen in the Quran, and there's an explanation for it within the Quran. There cannot be something mentioned in the Quran without another verse of the Quran saying that you should not continue doing that, and then from outside of the book there's somebody that says, I heard the Prophet or one of the Imams say that this teaching is no longer, you should not implement it. Absolutely not. That is baseless. The Prophet said, whatever is attributed to me that does not conform with the Quran, I have not said it. When it says it's abrogated, then that means it goes against the Quran. It's very clear. If this saying the teaching of the Quran is mansukh, the Quran said it's not going to be mansukh. It's going to remain. No batil. None of it is going to be disregarded. All of it will remain guidance based on numerous verses from that moment until the end of time, and whoever it reaches, it's guidance for whoever that particular verse reaches it. This hadith, this narration rather I should say, this riwayah in Arabic, is suggesting that no, that verse is there but it's no longer guidance. That means it is batil. That goes against the Quran. It's refuted by the Quran. The Prophet never said anything that goes against the Quran. And the Ahlul Bayt have never said anything that goes against the Quran or the sayings of the Prophet. So whatever the Quran says in its full meaning is accurate and it's complete from the perspective of it being in the Quran. So for example, if a ruling is mentioned in the Quran, whatever of it is mentioned in the Quran is complete. If there is a guidance regarding that ruling that has been mentioned in hadith, narrations, if we can verify those narrations, if we find that the verse of the Quran that discussed that ruling did not tell us one way or another that this is it, then there's nothing more than this. Or in other words, if the verse of the Quran related to that topic tells us there's more to it and it doesn't provide that, then if we can verify through methods that the Quran teaches us, the guidelines of the Quran, through those methods, if we find a narration, that is something for us to take. Classic example, the prayer. God many times mentions prayer. He mentions timings with not great detail, an outline, one can say, of timing, but without an outline of the structure of the prayer. But it explicitly mentions that there are nusuk related to the prayer, but he does not mention them in the Quran. We don't have the concept of raka'at in the Quran and what is a complete rak'ah, and each of those timings that we are to pray, how many rak'ah do we need to do, what does each rak'ah look like, and so on and so forth. We don't have that in the Quran. While it explicitly mentions there is prayer, it clearly does not mention the details of it, and it refers us to the Prophet. Well, that means the parts of the Quran that talk about that ritual, those parts need to be understood fully from the Quran, and then whatever we find of the Prophet in his words or through his Ahlul Bayt that conform with those understandings from those verses of the Quran, we take. Whatever goes against those understandings of, or those verses of the Quran related to the mansik, the nusuk, the rituals, then we leave them. But the parts that are mentioned there have got to be understood clearly by everyone. It's for everyone. It's not a discussion for fuqaha. Oh, let's leave this for jurists to decide what it means. We don't need to discuss it as lay people. That's not what the Quran says. Every bit of it is guidance for everyone. Even with the riwayat, this notion that, oh, let's leave that discussion to the fuqaha. Let's all become faqih. Who says that we should not all become fuqaha, or as many of us as possible? More and more people need to be able to refer to hadith even. Right now our discussion is the Quran. And I'll tell you that's from the Quran. The Quran who refers us, this book refers us to the Prophet, doesn't say that you should not acquire the tools to understand what the Prophet says and just rely on somebody else's. The majority of you, 99.9% of you, don't learn those, don't refer to those sayings. Just leave it on the 0.1% and then listen to whatever the 0.1% says to you. Don't investigate. That's not what the Quran says. Go to the Prophet himself. If we go to anyone else, it's to get to what the Prophet said, but we are told go to the Prophet himself. For whoever can go, they choose not to ask him. That means we are not, at least, the very least that could be said is that we are choosing to go less than what we can in terms of the proximity of the Prophet. We're choosing to avoid the Prophet. I'm like, oh, I don't need to go to the Prophet. I'll just go to this other person. I don't need to go to his household, who are part of that Baytul Risala, Baytul Nubuwwah. I don't need to go to them. I'll just rely on somebody else who goes, the verses of the Quran say, Kunu ma'as sadiqeen. The verses of the Quran say to refer to the Prophet. It doesn't say to refer to these other people, you're good. The other people are only means that are available to you to get to the Prophet when you don't have access. But keeping yourself away, never going to them, not even trying to gain that access, that's all the encouragements of getting closer to the Prophet. So anyhow, I think we have concluded this point. I will, in summary, mention it again. We're not trying to engage in the discipline of tafsir. Why? Because the discipline of tafsir is a man made discipline. Sure, it talks about verses of the Quran and the meanings in those verses. However, it does not discuss all of the verses of the Quran in the full extent of those verses. There are certain discussions that it is common. If you discuss them, then it's not considered the discipline of tafsir. They say it's not for this discipline. They say it's for another discipline. There are other limitations, not just this example. This was an example that I mentioned. There are many other examples that this discipline has created a certain man-made boundaries around understanding of the Quran. We want to avoid that. We just want to go and understand what the Quran says, nothing more, nothing less. We're not going to skip on any verse of the Quran, any discussion that comes from the verse of the Quran. We're not going to go with any prejudgments either of what this should say and what it should not say. I guess another example to mention, although I've mentioned it before as well, but I'll reiterate that because it's an important matter. We're not going to be using what they call sha'nun nuzul to understand the verses of the Quran. And we think it is wrong. I think it is wrong to do that. The reason for sha'nun nuzul, they say, is the context of revelation. That's what they translated as in English. And I use that language deliberately. I use that terminology or that wording very deliberately. And the reason for that is it makes it sound very appealing. Like, oh, you need to understand the context before you can understand the verse. That goes against the Quran itself. A and B. None of the narrations that we have about the context of revelation can be relied on. None of them. I very much emphasize and highlight that. None of the narrations. Just because in the books of tafsir, the discipline, all of them contain the same narration, it doesn't mean it's mutawatir, what they call mutawatir, and everyone agrees this is the context, everyone was there, we got through various sources. It's not like that. That's not how it is. The narrations found in books of hadith do not give us many of the details, and the ones that are there do not necessarily give us accurate details. The parts that they are giving us as details, they don't necessarily give us accurate details. Some of them are clearly fabricated. The bottom line is we cannot be certain that we know the full context. Okay. And the first point we mentioned, I want to go back. I said there's 2 points. There's 2 reasons. One, the second one I mentioned, and I elaborated on that first, was that we're not even sure that these narrations are giving us an accurate and complete context. And the first reason that I mentioned, the requirement of context for understanding what God is saying goes against the clear sayings of the Quran. The Quran does not say you need anything else. The Quran does not have a wording that it misses an indicator telling us what God intended by this sentence that needs to be understood from outside the book, period. That's just how the book was made. God says in it, the Prophet said through narrations that are repeatedly mentioned by the Prophet, and it makes full sense. The Prophet said, the anchor in your understanding and whatever's attributed to me, the guidance that you will receive after I depart from you, is the Quran. If anyone, and the lady Fatima Zahra salamullah alayha demonstrated that right after the Prophet in the context of Fadak, right after the Prophet, someone who was close to the Prophet said that Anbiya don't leave, according to history, this is not history is not the same as studying the Quran. The Quran is 100% from God. We know, therefore, it is 100% accurate. History can be discussed. I'm sure that this is something that occurred in history. There's discussions, though. Let me put that there because it's not part of our discussion here. I'm giving this as an example. I am convinced that after the demise of the Prophet, someone very close to the Prophet claimed that prophets do not leave behind any inheritance. The lady Fatima Zahra Salamullahi alayha did not say, well, the Prophet is my father, I know better than you. No, he didn't say that. She didn't argue like that. She said, God says, وَوَرِثَ Dawood Sulaiman, if I got the order of the words right. Sulaiman is the son of Dawood, and the Quran says that the warith, the person who inherited from Dawood, is Sulaiman. You're saying the Prophet said something, but what you're attributing to him goes against what the Quran clearly says. Therefore, that's the reason why the Prophet has definitely not said that. The Quran does not need anything for the wording to be understood. It does not require any context. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens in the discipline of tafseer is reliance in understanding of the Quran on Sha'nun Nuzul, on the narrations that we have that suggest or tell us, and we cannot verify whether they are accurate or not, or how accurate they are. We need to rely on that. This in the discipline of tafsir, mufassirin, some of them very heavily, some less, but it's there. The influence of the narrations of, the accounts of, the context in which and the occurrence in which the verse was revealed. And that changes the meanings. They interpret it based on what the account says and not based on the wording of the Quran itself. And then again, the last thing I will say, not only are we not doing this as a discipline of tafsir, and so we're avoiding calling it tafsir, I'm not going to quote anyone either. It's very common in a discipline, and this is how a discipline goes. You talk about what the opinions of the scholars who are considered the top ranking scholars with works that they have written that are available. Their views are to be mentioned. We're not studying a discipline. We're trying to understand the Quran. If there is a verse and we discuss it, and in the process of learning the understanding, I have come across the view of a scholar out of respect for that scholar and him being the first person I read that understanding from, and then I look at the Quran and I find that to be accurate. I may not always, I'm not making a promise here that I'll always mention that. So if a understanding is presented and then someone finds it in the book of a scholar, like, okay, this is, I forget the word, but we're not giving credit to the person who came up with it. I'm not. We're trying to understand the Quran here. If I remember, I would like to give credit. If I actually do remember that I got that understanding from someone else, and then I looked and I saw that was accurate in my understanding. When I look at the wording, I also understand it the same way. I will try to give credit to that person that I first came across that understanding of the Quran from. But it's not our intention, it's not my intention to the way a discipline works to mention different views, and some say this, some say that. No, I'm going to explain what I understand of the Quran, and I think that is more beneficial. This isn't to say that I am such a great person that I think nobody else's views should be mentioned. No, I think whoever tries to understand the Quran, they should try to understand the Quran themselves. If anyone is watching these videos, they should not think that if they're watching this video, they should write down what they hear the speaker say and then start telling people this is what the Quran says. No, this is what this person is saying the Quran says. I hope to, and my intention is to spark the interest of people in understanding the Quran through explaining the verses of the Quran, and I would prefer if people do the same thing once they look at the Quran. If they are able to understand it themselves, and hopefully they will be more and more able, and that's one of the objectives of these sessions, that they will not mention this person's name as to, this person said and therefore it's no. If you understand it, say, give people what you understand. I think God's book says this. This is what I understand of it. That's how it should be. And we hope to see more and more discussions, and in each discussion in circles and online, whoever wants, forming podcasts perhaps, and discussing what each person on the podcast, people calling in and talking about what they understand of the Quran. This effort in trying to understand the Quran collectively is going to lead to a better collective understanding of the Quran, meaning more and more of us are going to have a better understanding of the Quran. Inshallah, Allah give us a tawfiq to read the Quran, study the Quran, understand the Quran, and to be able to implement the teachings found in His book of guidance. Inshallah, walhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen.